Good afternoon. Welcome to this first UpSkill Works virtual forum where we will be bringing you interviews with business and community leaders, policymakers, and leading thinkers on the key workforce issues the Houston region faces. I'm Peter Beard and I lead the Greater Houston Partnership's UpSkill Houston initiative that partners with employers, educational leaders, and community-based organizations to strengthen the talent pipeline our region's employers need and to help Houstonians connect to the good jobs that increase economic mobility and prosperity. Before we get to our guest, I want to review a couple housekeeping details. The Greater Houston Partnership is a trusted source for information related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to highlight a specific resource as each of you considers how to reopen safely. The partnership is providing guidance to ensure companies and organizations can safely reopen, or as we say, work safe. Specifically, the partnership has delivered 15 WorkSafe 2.0 principles to provide guidance to companies and organizations while also protecting practices and trade association guidance to help businesses develop sector-specific plans to minimize the risk of transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace. This guidance can be found listed by sector on the partnership's updated WorkSafe page. At the conclusion of the webinar, we'll highlight this resource again. You'll see some other materials on the screen right now. Some other housekeeping details: all attendees are muted and your video is turned off for the entirety of the webinar. Also, the chat is not to be used for questions and answers. This will not be moderated for questions. If you're having technical difficulties, the chat function can connect you with our production team. If you have questions for Parker or me, you should direct them to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. This will be moderated. And today, we're fortunate to have our good friend, Parker Harvey. He serves as the principal economist at the Gulf Coast Workforce Board. Prior to arriving here in Houston, Parker worked for the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics in its Midwest office in Chicago. And it looks like we both arrived here in Houston about the same time in 2014. So Parker is a seasoned economist that has a great understanding of labor markets and can help people understand our dynamic regional economy and its workforce. Today's topic we'll be addressing is the current state of Houston's labor economy and what will our labor economy look like in 6 to 12 months. So welcome, Parker. And in preparing for our conversation, it seemed to me that we would want to cover two broad topics. What's the current state of Houston's regional labor economy? And what's the longer term prospects. So those are kind of the topics we wanted to confront today. So welcome, Parker.
Thank you for having me.
So Parker, so where are we today? And what's the current state of Houston's labor economy in terms of job losses and what's the order of magnitude?
Sure. Well, we are seeing unprecedented levels of disruption to our labor market that have never really happened in living memory at this point. There's a lot going on. We'll start with the unemployment rate and kind of what that looks like at the moment, because it's our most traditional standard metric for gauging how things are going. Unfortunately, though, it's not the most timely, but nonetheless, though, it's still the gold standard at this point. So let's go back to March and February. So our unemployment rate jumped from about 3.9 to 5.1%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that single month jump puts it on par with what we saw in, say, May of 2009. So it's one of the biggest 1 month jumps we've ever seen. And keep in mind that we're just talking about March at this point, and particularly the first half of March. So it's not fully reflecting the full range of disruption that we're anticipating. Keep in mind, the first half of March, we saw things like the shutdown of the rodeo, cancellation of conventions, things like that. It wasn't until the latter half that we saw the stay-at-home orders being issued at the county, state, and federal levels. So again, that number, it doesn't seem very impressive at this point, but again, we're already having to use superlatives to describe what's going on there.
So as you think about it, how big are Parker? What are the UI claims, unemployed insurance claims today? Where are we seeing the job
UI
loss?
has obviously been, I mean, in the news quite a bit. You've probably seen that chart out there where it's just, you know, lots of little squiggly lines and then it goes completely vertical. That's regardless if you're looking at the nation, state, our area here. Right now, cumulatively, from about, we'll say the first week of March to about last week, we've got about 314,000 initial claims for unemployment insurance. A normal, let's say 6-week period, give or take, would probably put us around 25 or 30. So we're still seeing about 10x the number of claims that we would see if the economy was functioning normally. If you back out the numbers and you assume that all 314,000 of those claims are individuals, legitimate claims, and there's no reason to really think otherwise at this point, that would put our unemployment rate somewhere around 12 to 12.5%, maybe going forward the next couple of months here. And that would take out our previous all-time high unemployment rate at about 8.7%, I want to say, back in 2009. So we're definitely going to hit some new records here. Fortunately, ones that we prefer not to, but that's just kind of where we are at the moment.
Where are we seeing the job losses, Parker?
They're pretty widespread. So if we back up to, let's say, the jobs numbers that we got for March, most of our major sectors saw losses, some of which saw some of the biggest losses for the month of March we've ever had. Construction was a big one. Manufacturing was a big one. We also saw leisure and hospitality, which is where your bars, your restaurants, your hotels are. What's interesting, though, is that this is the first March we've ever had job losses in leisure and hospitality since records began. Typically, you see job gains in that part of the economy from February all the way through June, completely uninterrupted. And this has now broken that streak that went back 30 years. So, and this is what we all know. Obviously, that part of the economy, the service sector, has really been hit hard. So it's not to be unexpected, but nonetheless, though, when you see something that breaks a long-standing trend like that, you definitely take notice.
I also know that in this near term, as you've been looking at kind of what's been going on in terms of people losing jobs, you've also been looking on kind of what's happening where people are hiring. You know, and so what are the trends you're seeing in the region in terms of who's hiring and in what areas?
Yeah, so to get at the issue or answer to the question, well, who's hiring has been a challenge. There's not a lot of good, we'll say, public sector available data that answer the question, well, really who's hiring that's timely. So what I've been doing is I've been mining data on job ads that are out there. And because that's our most timely source. That data is updated daily, in fact. And that's a level of frequency that's frankly kind of difficult to work with, but it's the best we can do. And really it's in response to the question that I've gotten at least a couple dozen times now in the last few weeks on just who is hiring, if there's any hiring going on whatsoever. So what's going on in that space? Well, there's not a ton, I'll be honest. Most of our major sectors, actually all of our major sectors and all of our major occupational families have seen a drop in job ads out there in the last 60 days. That's just the bottom line. You really have to drill down to individual specific fields or careers or jobs or occupations, and you have to look at specific employers to find who or what's being hired. If you look at it from an occupational standpoint, I would group it into maybe 3 or 4 big buckets. The first and probably most interesting one for me, although it's not very helpful for everyone else, media and communications. With the sheer amount of content that's being developed around COVID every single day, you can see a surge in demand for editors, writers, video editors, photographers, even interpreters and translators. That's really been a big one for the last couple, like 2 months here. And it makes sense. I mean, I've done a scrape of the Chronicle's website, trying to get a timeline of the things that have happened over the last couple of months. And just using a single keyword, coronavirus, I ended up with 3,500 articles. So the quantity that's being put out there is absolutely phenomenal. So you're seeing a lot of demand there at the moment. Unfortunately, the barriers to getting into that part of the economy are fairly high. Beyond that, you're seeing public education. There's still demand out there that probably will persist regardless of what the economy is doing. But it does run the gamut all the way from elementary through high school. Beyond that, healthcare. Now, healthcare is an interesting one. Where you're seeing the demand is mainly for specialty physicians, more so than for the more middle skill type healthcare jobs that are out there. And one of the things that, the way this has been portrayed at this point is that healthcare, everybody's on the front lines. There's a surge in demand for healthcare workers. And the reality is this, think about the fact that most procedures, things that you would have done are more elective in nature than they are emergencies. The ratio of emergencies to things that you could conceivably, defer for a while, obviously, the latter outweighs the former. So there are a lot more workers in healthcare that are being furloughed or just idle, if nothing else, even if they haven't been furloughed, than you would imagine. And I've gotten that corroborated through people I know that work in healthcare. If you notice the GDP numbers that came out yesterday, there was a headline that the biggest drag on GDP in the first quarter was healthcare spending. Now, that seems completely counterintuitive given what's going on because we have a public health crisis. But in reality, though, most healthcare workers probably aren't going to be on the front lines. Think about that dental appointment or the cleaning you were going to have in the last 2 months. That's been put on the back burner indefinitely. So that's another area where you're seeing very, very selective hiring if you're seeing any at all. Beyond that, a little bit in the skilled trades, mostly things like helper type roles for the skilled trades and a few miscellaneous ones, but there's not a lot of variety at this point, and that's to be expected. So what I'm going to be looking for is when that we finally turn a corner on that.
So as you know, UpSkill Houston focuses on those occupations that require education and skill.
Okay. Peter, actually, could you go back to that last question there? So you froze there for a good solid like 5 or 10 seconds.
Oh, sorry about that. So, as you know, we're kind of in the middle skill space with UpSkill Houston.
Yes.
And so I was wondering, as you've looked at that data and you kind of hinted at it in your last question, what trends are you seeing there that we should know about in the near term?
Well, those kind of occupations, as well as our high skill, high growth occupations as well, which if you're not familiar with, they're the occupations we're willing to support with training dollars through our organization. Either of those two sets, not really a whole lot of new hiring or additional hiring going on. And let me be clear about something. There are still 90,000 active job ads for our region as of today. They're still out there. That's down significantly though from where it was, let's say a year ago, which would have been about 140, 145,000. So we've cut the number of active job ads by about a third. That runs across the board. No matter the skill level of the occupation, it really doesn't matter. There's been a significant pullback on the part of employers.
Okay. So before we kind of get to the longer term prospects, which is where we probably, given what you've shared so far, should be more focused on, I want to kind of see if there are any questions from the audience. And I see we have one. Do you see a need for supply chain specifically in the healthcare sector, or are you seeing the need?
Interesting question. Supply chain is sort of difficult to get at with respect to a specific sector, like for example, healthcare. I'm not sure if it's a really good question. I don't know if there's a way to sort of tease that portion of it out. You would have to assume as much, especially if, say, for personal protective equipment is going to be almost a standard fact of life for going out in public for the foreseeable future. So it would make sense. I will say this much. In general, you do see additional demand within the sort of transportation, warehousing, logistics part of the economy. Think about the fact that, grocery stores, especially in the early more hoarding stages, which I'm glad we finally sort of moved past that. But because they were going through so much inventory so quickly, you needed more drivers to have more deliveries to keep up and to keep shelves stocked. So there definitely is a drive there to get more people in. So there's no reason why I wouldn't expect that would extend to healthcare as well. But again, noted, portions of healthcare are not really in high demand right now because they're not emergencies. So it's sort of a mixed bag is what my answer would be to that.
And there's another question. It's the obvious one, given the headwinds we're facing here in Houston, which is, what are you seeing in the energy sector?
We've got a long road ahead of us there, frankly. You could already start to see a slowdown in our energy sector as far back as a year ago, believe it or not. That seems to be where the momentum really topped out. The remainder of the year, we were still looking okay, but by the time we got to the end of last year, you were starting to see things finally turn negative year over year for the first time in a couple of years now. And that was before we had single-digit oil as well as COVID. So that part of the economy, I think it's going to be pretty tough. I've been looking at the most detailed data I'm able to get my hands on, take it with a huge grain of salt, but it allows me to be able to see specifically who is filing and what their occupations self-reported are. That data, which covers, let's say, mid-March through mid-April, skimming it, I didn't see a ton of jobs that appeared to be in oil and gas, but I suspect as this goes on that we're going to start to see more of those people. So I think the composition of layoffs is going to shift going forward. I think the service sector is already a lot of that has already happened. I think now we're going to be moving on to the white collar jobs going forward.
No, and that's consistent with some of the stuff we've been hearing from our energy partners, which is they're beginning to think about how are they going to contain costs. They understand their supply chain in terms of, you know, the services they get from others are going to be hugely constrained, but now they're going to begin managing, you know, in the traditional way is, you know, are we going to allow folks to kind of take early retirement and manage in the cost containment space? So I think there's, to that point, there's probably, you know, significant headwinds in that space.
Absolutely.
We also had a job about how many of the 90,000 job ads are likely on hold as an employer navigates the COVID response versus they need them today.
You're absolutely right. So this is just a scraping of what is available out there on the internet as of X date. It doesn't mean that those job ads won't be pulled tomorrow. It may just be that some haven't gotten around to pulling them. There are a number of things that be going on there. It's more about just directionally where we are relative to, say, where we were a year ago this time. So I wouldn't even necessarily say that those are all active ones that people can go out and get tomorrow, but they are out there. So some percentage of them are still active. There is still hiring going on, but it's much more firm specific at this point and occupation specific.
So when you say that, I think you would also probably, as I've looked at them, some of them are in non-economic, they're not impacted by the economy generally. You mentioned education, which is teachers are going to be hired because schools expand and you've got folks retiring out of that system. So it tends to be a higher skill level, as I saw some of your work previously.
Yeah, by and large, there is. Yeah, it does tend to skew more towards, say, bachelor degree type occupations, things like that. But on the topic of teachers, though, one of the things, and we might come back to this a little bit later on, but what I think you're going to see is a bit of a shift there in terms of hiring of teachers that have the ability to translate their content into a digital format for delivery virtually, as opposed or with the same level of quality as you would get in a classroom. What I'm hearing from people I know with school-age children is that they're finding that some teachers that otherwise seemed fairly effective, they've now begun deferring to YouTube videos almost wholesale to replace their lectures. And then that begs a lot of interesting questions about the value proposition there and whatnot. And this is not a knock against them, but the point being, though, is that that will probably shift how you look at teachers and what you look for in hiring going forward, as opposed to maybe perhaps the traditional classroom model of the past.
And it could also potentially bring in kind of classroom aides because of the attention that's going to be required, which may be a slightly lower skill, but under the supervision of someone higher skilled.
Correct. Yeah, you may see more of like almost like a college professor with TA sort of structure across a larger number of students virtually. I don't know how prevalent that'll be, but I could see that shift happening potentially somewhat going forward.
Okay. So you obviously, having been at BLS, you probably look at other regions, and how do the job losses in Houston compare to other metros of kind of comparable size and complexity?
Well, just given the sheer amount of what goes on here, I don't have a ton of time to do that, but here's what I did notice when I was digging through some of the data. I was looking to see what was the percentage increase in the number of unemployed individuals from February to March, not just for our region, but statewide, basically all of our metros in the state, across the country. And what I found is that we saw a much larger percentage jump in the number of unemployed individuals. I think our jump was about 30% in a span of 1 month. Nationally, it was about 20. And so that was probably one of the more sort of troubling things I discovered out of all of that. So going forward, in some ways, it looks as though we might be a little bit more disadvantaged. Interestingly enough, there were some states where, believe it or not, they had the number of unemployed individuals fell. I think there were a few obscure ones, like maybe it was Nevada or somewhere like that, but there were some that saw some fall. Yeah. But by and large, most did see increases, and we were kind of towards the upper third as far as seeing a jump in unemployed individuals. And we've got two things going against us, virus as well as oil. So.
Yeah. So I'm going to take one last question, and then we're going to kind of get into the real question, which is, what's it going to look like in the longer term as we begin to rebound? Obviously, everyone's shut down right now. Sure. But someone noted that they're seeing a slight increase in job postings for allied health, personal care aides, home health aides. Is this true across the region?
Uh, yeah, and again, keep in mind the data I'm able to look at can get no more specific than maybe county level at best. So I have seen some of that. There does seem to be more demand for some CNAs, things like that, in pockets and specific to certain employers. But how widespread that is, it's really hard to tell at this point.
Okay. So, the big question everyone's thinking about is obviously here's the near term. Can we get people employed and what are the opportunities? And doesn't sound like a pretty picture right now.
It's really not. Where I see things kind of going though is say sort of medium to long term though. You're gonna have to look at occupations from in a different way. Those that require physical presence to be able to deliver a good or service. And what does that mean from a public health standpoint? So does that mean that industrial hygiene now has to be integrated into occupations that otherwise it would have never really been that much of an issue? For example, imagine if you're an HVAC technician, all right? So you're going into private homes. Does that mean now that you need to wear protective gear the entire time you're there? Does it mean you need to be able to produce documentation saying that this person has not been infected in the last, say, week or whatever time frame? What's the risk mitigation strategy that goes around occupations going forward where there's a potential for there to be transmission of the virus? And then on the other hand, the jobs that don't need to be done in person, what kind of skills do you need to be able to navigate that going forward, particularly digital technology, what we're using right now to be able to conduct this? I don't know that anyone was really an expert in using this kind of technology a month and a half, 2 months ago, and I think we all are now. So things like that, those kind of shifts is really kind of how you need to start looking at it. And rather than, I would say, chasing whatever the latest trend is, maybe you'll see, more demand for sanitation, remediation, things like that. But that's a function of the shock to the system that's happened recently. It doesn't really apply to the fundamentals of our economy, the industries that will continue to make up what Houston does going forward. So I would encourage people to think more in terms of just the tweaks to the existing sort of configuration out there rather than we're just bulldozing something or we're looking for something that's popping up that's new. The taxonomy that exists to be able to identify jobs out there doesn't respond quickly enough for you to be able to identify new things coming up as a result of something like this. It just doesn't exist.
So going back to your first point, if you as an employer can kind of control your whole environment, you're going to be you're going to figure that out. But the minute you start thinking about the external factors that begin to show up in your workplace, whether it's through your employees, that's where you're going to have to think about risk mitigation differently based on what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's interesting now that, you see this with, it's sort of a funny example, but pizza delivery services, they've put the whole no contact delivery as the centerpiece of their marketing efforts now. It's not just, ostensibly it's under the guise of, we're concerned about our customers. It's, this is now how we're marketing our product in order to do this. And so I think employers out there that are able to instill that kind of confidence in their customers earlier on and to be much more consistent about it are going to have sort of a first mover advantage as far as being successful as the economy starts to reopen rather than others. So that's one other thing I'm sort of predicting will happen.
And to your comment, I think Ben Bernanke describes this event to be more like a natural disaster than a depression in the sense that there were major market elements that went dysfunctional. And so what I was hearing you say basically is as we think in the long term, the fundamental core elements of Houston's economy are going to be there slightly adjusted and tweaked.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually not a big fan of describing what's going on as depression. This is such a different animal. This is not excess production or excess, in the financial system or something like that, resulting in falling prices, that's not what this is. This is a different beast entirely. The good news is we know exactly what the cause of our problem is. Yeah. And whereas with, the financial crisis, there were issues all over the system gumming up things. This is a little bit more straightforward. If you can figure out how to get testing under, widespread, you can isolate and contain. If you can get a vaccine going, you can turn this around. It's just a matter of, again, getting people to get a little bit more confident and, follow through there. But this is such a different thing that, yeah, you really do have to just focus on the fundamentals here. Don't get sidetracked by the fact that we have a shock to the system that will be painful. Don't get me wrong, but in the long run, it really won't change the trajectory of what Houston does, I don't think.
Right. And the reason I use Ben Bernanke is because his whole discipline was to study the Great Depression. And for him to say this is not the depression, but it's more like a natural disaster that we've always come out of, our economy stays similar, very much the same. That's why I was using him as the reference, because he understands it so well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So some of the things I've heard, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is, and it gets to one of your points, which is we're using this technology and things we already kind of knew in terms of automation, digital skills being more and more required, artificial intelligence showing up more. Is this going to accelerate the presence of those skills going forward?
It could do a couple of different things. So it could either increase the demand for certain skills and talent. It might not change it at all, or it could actually decrease. So let's think of transportation, warehousing, distribution, logistics, which is pretty important collectively here in the region. So you could envision that with people buying more online, that you might have more need for just people in that space in absolute terms, talent in that sense. You could also have a need for more people who are versed in industrial hygiene, as I mentioned, for products that otherwise didn't merit it in the past. Or you could have a decline because, well, we know that the vector and the transmission of the virus typically is people. And so one way of getting around that problem would be to remove them from the process. That'd be the least ideal of the three, but you can see that potentially happening. I mean, automation of warehousing and distribution logistics has already been there for many, many years. Question whether or not will this accelerate that? It has the potential to do so. So I do see this accelerating it in some places, the demand for certain talent, scaling it back in others, transforming in others. So you've got one of three possibilities, and those aren't mutually exclusive either.
When you were with BLS, it was right around the time of the Great Recession. Are there any learnings we should take in that space? Once again, it's not a financial crisis because of the liquidity that's being pumped in right now, but it slowed our national economy down in such a long way. What are the learnings, if anything, we should take from the Great Recession?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there's really a whole lot of takeaways. I mean, I do recall sitting in a cubicle and I could see out of my window, and the U.S. Capitol building is within probably a quarter of a mile of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so you could see our elected officials scurrying in and out of the Capitol while TARP was being passed. I didn't fully have an appreciation for the severity of the situation at the time because I had no point of reference up to that point. No one really did. But it was good to see, though, that, well, our elected officials did pull it together to be able to help bolster the economy and try to put a floor under the fall here. We've seen that this time around. The only problem you run into is that when policy is rushed, you end up getting unintended consequences, such as what we've seen with PPP and publicly traded companies that perhaps did not need a loan participating in that and then giving it back after PR issues start to pop up. But that's going to happen. So they could either, there was a need for a response immediately. I understand why. Hopefully now going forward, we're going to fix some of those things, but this is what happens when you have to rush policy. You end up getting distortions, unfortunately, on the other side in some cases.
Because I think one of the learnings would be we're going to potentially, if we don't find a way to help people find their pathways, have another cohort of individuals that disconnect from the system. They graduate from high school and graduate from college, and there's no job for them. Yeah, I think that's one of the learnings.
Yeah, it is. And that's a genuine concern that people in the service sector part of the economy, where they're getting that early work experience to hopefully move on to more higher paying, more value added jobs, that they may not even be able to get a good handle on one of those rungs towards the bottom of the sort of skill ladder. That's a concern. And then, of course, you've got people who've been working for a very long time getting essentially flushed out of the economy, what we saw during the Great Recession. People who were within 5 to 7, 10 years of retirement, unfortunately having a hard time getting back into the workforce and essentially just trying to make it until retirement actually was a viable option. And so again, there's a concern that depending on how long this goes on, that you might see a repeat of those two phenomena. And so we're going to have to think a lot more depth about how we as a workforce board will try to address that going forward through training and whatnot and retraining of individuals.
No, and so that raises a really good question from one of our audience that was really looking at where do we see the growth potentially beginning to occur whenever we come in to kind of coming back to a much more full-based economy? You know, and what are the skills and credentialed sectors that are going to be really important for the region going forward?
I don't know that there would actually be all that different from what we saw before. It's just going to be the timing of how things come back. So service sector, I'm not super optimistic about, frankly, because the footprint that you operated under prior to all of this has now been cut down by 3/4. So the question is, how many of those businesses are going to be able to fully re-employ the same amount of staff they had before? Probably not a lot of them. So I don't know that the skill issue is really going to be that big of a deal, frankly, besides, again, how do you operate in environments where there's a public health concern where there wasn't before? Beyond that, I don't know that I see it fundamentally changing so much. I realize that, everything's very, very dramatic right now, but I don't see how that changes. Your skilled trades will still be skilled trades, for example. That doesn't go away. Beyond that, though, I don't know. I've been debating whether or not you would see service sector come back before professional or vice versa. What does that look like? What's the sequence of events? I'm still not entirely sure, frankly. I mean, we're starting the reopening now. We're going to let that expire basically today and going forward. My fear is what will happen is that we'll get a second wave of infections. It will damage consumer confidence again, and then it'll make it that much harder to restart when we reopen the next time, because people will go, well, is it safe again? So that's actually one of my biggest concerns, is that it's going to be harder for us to break out of this if we see a flare-up in infections as a result of reopening things, perhaps maybe a bit sooner than we should have, but we'll have to wait and see. Certainly hoping for the best.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'm hearing you say, Parker, is there's not even enough data to know how we're going to kind of recover in this in terms of the sequencing of which sectors are going to come online.
No, I wouldn't say so. The only thing I can just talk about is maybe the shape of the recovery. So ideally, a V-shaped recovery would probably be what you want. You hit bottom very quickly, you bounce back to where you were, everything returns to normal. I don't see that happening for us, especially because of oil. The checkmark Nike swoosh sort of recovery might be more in line with what we can expect. Actually, I think it might be closer to almost like a W or some sort of distorted W shape, where we have some fits and starts before we start our nice steady recovery back to some percentage of where we were before. Again, whether or not we get back to 100%, I'm not sure. We didn't do that with our most recent oil crash in 2015, 2016. We maybe recovered a third to half of those jobs that we lost in oil and gas. So that's kind of how I see this playing out potentially, unless, again, there's a miracle vaccine that restores everything tomorrow.
I mean, what should be the indicators or signals that would suggest we've bottomed?
Well, I'm going to be looking at seeing more employers increasing the number of job ads they have out there than the ones that are pulling job ads. We haven't quite hit that inflection point, but it does appear to be slowing down, that fewer job ads are being pulled. Most of them are just kind of like holding firm. When I see that shift the other direction, that for me is going to signal that something has changed finally and that we may be turning a corner. But how long that takes, that bottom could last far longer than any of us ever imagined. So,
and one of the things that I think was beginning to occur, both at the national, regional, and our economy, was the increasing of wages, the real wage and some other things. And so is it likely to see some stagnation now because of such a weak economy?
I don't see how you wouldn't have that. I mean, obviously, if you only need to reemploy a quarter of the people you had before, then the leverage is all with the employer at this point. So I can't see how we would have significant wage gains, real wage gains, for quite a while.
Well, and to that point where you were, where the employer gets to choose, they're probably going to bring back their most highly productive people.
Correct.
Which then creates, the opportunity of how do you continue to reskill and upskill them, but it then creates, an opportunity for the region to think about how are we helping those that aren't going to be employed as quickly, and right. What's the social safety net? What are the training programs that are going to help them kind of find their path to occupations that work? Which is where I think, going back to our earlier conversation, is where should we be saying, here's where you need to be focused and trying to build toward?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is definitely some things we're going to have to think about. And part of it's just going to try to get everything moving forward kind of simultaneously to sort of pick up that slack. It's going to be hard to sort of leapfrog these steps. Unfortunately, it's going to have to be a concerted effort from multiple angles.
Which then really raises a question of, have we diversified our economy sufficiently, to kind of support that kind of, balanced recovery?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this quite a bit. I've been trying to measure how well diversified we are for a few years now, several years, in fact. I'm not fully convinced that we've diversified as much as we should have. Again, if the price of oil collapses and we see some of our key sectors tank immediately, for me, that signals that diversification isn't there. The good news, though, is that we are far larger than, say, we were in the 1980s. So a massive number of job losses on a 1 million job base versus a 3 million job base, that's one of the few things that gives me comfort in all of this and what did throughout our most recent downturn in 2015, 2016.
Well, that's helpful. So a couple kind of very specific questions have shown up. One is, and it really gets to what you were beginning to talk about, which is someone with HVAC coming in. Are we going to, given the industrial cleaning and other things that are going to be there, are there going to be opportunities that are going to get created as a result of this? In addition to the folks that are going to trace people around inspections and, building safety and workplace safety?
Potentially, you definitely could. There's going to have to be much more emphasis on that. Whether or not that turns into a full-blown separate compliance type role in a number of those jobs, I'm not entirely sure yet, but the function will certainly be there. It may be integrated into existing roles, or it may have to be its own separate specialty. I'm not completely sure which direction that's going to go at this point. It just really depends on what the regulations look like going forward. Part of that's going to be, set by our legislators. Part of it's going to be, well, if I'm a business, how do I make sure that my customers feel confident about my delivery of services and their safety and health? So some of these things are going to kind of push this one way or the other, I think.
Well, and we do have an analogy here in Houston when you think about, the creation of the Houston Area Safety Council to ensure that workplaces were going to be safe in the petrochemical industry, and there was going to be a common place where you're training workers to be that, in that environment safe. I would imagine that there's going to be other opportunities that there may be new roles, but there may be new types of training and skills that are going to be necessary that are embedded within the workforce. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of programs, a lot of post-secondary education programs that are out there right now will probably have to look at, well, how do we integrate something around this into our programs going forward? I think you'd be remiss if you didn't at least consider it seriously or try to do it. Because this is not going to be, this will still be with us in some way, shape, or form for quite a while, a number of years, I imagine.
No, and it could be. And, if Bill Gates is right, this is one of many that are going to start showing up. And, he was pretty prescient when he was, in 2015 and before, talking about that pandemic was going to be a big challenge for the world.
Yeah, he absolutely was, yeah.
So when you think about, business-related efforts, travel, hotels, and airline, they may be the last to recover if folks don't feel comfortable traveling for a while. So how should we be thinking about that?
Well, bottom line is this. Any business model that requires a density of customers, I think it's going to be languishing for quite a while, unfortunately. There's just simply not much else you can do about that until people are confident. Until the social distancing protocols have been lifted to some degree or scaled back, those are going to have a tough time. They just simply are. Everything from mass transit to entertainment to you name it, anything that requires that is going to be challenged for quite a while.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And this is related kind of to the health issues, which is, with the shift to virtual and technology, are there going to be more needs for entry-level IT positions, or would it be more like it's just going to get embedded into people's individual skill sets?
I think you'll probably have to see some beef up there, honestly, in the IT space. Just support for it. We've got the technology there, but I think there's going to be more of a push to improve it, as well as also make it more widely available for everyone. That's one of the things I could see coming out of this is access to broadband. I think Finland was one of the ones that incorporated as part of its basic human rights or something to that effect about a decade or so ago now. I could see, I don't know if we would go so far as to do that, but there would be more of a push to make sure that all segments of society have equal access to some level of broadband, because without it, I mean, you simply can't participate in the workforce going forward fully. So I see that changing.
No, and I think that's true. We were on a call with the U.S. Chamber where this has been, as to your point, they've talked about it for a long time. And they're now like, is this the opportunity to make the infrastructure play of the only way we're going to have a long-term competitive economy is that everyone has access to this.
Yeah.
And as we've talked to school districts and others, the digital divide as it relates to not only the hardware, but the access to the broadband is the barrier. And as we think about it, you know, one of the things we should probably be thinking about is not only are we solving the educational issue, but we should be also solving the 2-gen problem of the parents to make sure they have access so we can provide skills development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I wholeheartly agree with everything you're saying there.
So folks, feel free to keep adding Q&A. I think you've seen I've been working my way through it. There's one question that I know has been talked about in the news and employers think about is, you know, with the enhanced unemployment benefit right now, you know, what are the incentives and disincentives that show up for folks to kind of, you know, come off the bench and, you know, back onto the playing field?
Yeah, there's definitely been some concerns around that because of the amounts that were being put out there, the one-off of $1,200, et cetera, things like that, plus extended unemployment benefits and whatnot. My understanding is that in some markets around the country, the wage replacement actually exceeds what people might have been earning before. So that does create some problematic disincentives to work. I can understand why people might respond in that way, but you have to think about it in terms of the best way to become more employable is by working. So the benefits are great and all, but ultimately it won't allow you to be a more competitive worker going forward if you voluntarily opt out for longer than you might otherwise.
Yeah.
So I would try to discourage people from looking at it that way, because ultimately things will shift and you will need to go back to work. And those who've been acquiring skills this whole time or more so will have an advantage over you. So that's kind of how I look at that.
And on your point, we should be, you know, as a region, helping people find connections to ways they are enhancing their skill levels right now and pointing them in the right direction, which probably means more digital skills, you know, more customer service, you know, people-facing skills, problem-solving skills than before.
Yeah, and all those things would be true even if we didn't have COVID-19. All those, everything you're saying there would still be necessary. So
yeah. Because I think this whole conversation we've had related to automation and, you know, the digital piece of it is really suggesting there are going to be, you know, and it also showed up in the fact that our most essential workers are the ones we probably don't pay well enough, that are the ones, because they're customer facing, whether they're in nursing homes or assisted living facilities or childcare or, you know, retail, are the ones you still need folks doing that.
absolutely, absolutely.
Because when you think about it, you know, probably a year ago when you walked into McDonald's, you went to the cash register and they took your order. Now you go to a kiosk and that person is not now in the transaction, but providing the good customer experience. And so you've got to adapt to the digital technology.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that hasn't changed at all. I spent a lot of time last fall doing presentations around the future of work and things like that. And the digital skills component, it was evident that having additional digital skills provided an additional buffer from potentially being displaced by automation and AI. That's for sure. So that hasn't gone away. That will probably, if anything, that will become a bit more important going forward, because jobs that could have been done more in person may now be done remotely a little bit more often. And so you're going to have those skills to be able to compete.
Yeah, and when I think about it, there are probably 2 or 3 platforms where you'd want someone to have at least some capability. Yeah. To me, one of them is Salesforce, because customer service and relationship management is going to be critical to any position going forward.
Absolutely.
Excel and Tableau to do fundamental data analytics is another one. And so when you begin to think about the digital skills everyone should be leaving any training program with, it would be probably in those spaces.
Absolutely. No disagreement there whatsoever.
So I have a fairly technical question here.
Okay.
how can we find zip code specific unemployment data that's recent? I know.
You can't. It simply doesn't exist. I really wish it did. That level of detail isn't really readily available from any official sources, any third-party sources that do it. The only other source I could think of might be the American Community Survey. You might be able to get down to, let's say, census tract level. However, that data lags by quite a bit, by a couple of years. There won't be anything that is real time at that level of detail that you would be able to be able to access and do anything with. Unfortunately, it just simply isn't there. The fact that we're able to get data even just down to counties, or claims data down to our counties, that is a monumental leap. That really wasn't readily available more than a few weeks ago. So they're trying their best to get us as much detail as we can, but unfortunately that level of detail it isn't there.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, the Texas Workforce Commission has gone out of its way to make the county level detail available at an aggregate level. And I know that they've also begun to do it at an industry level, but it's only at a state level, correct?
Correct, yeah, that has been around that's been around for quite a while. The historical data for that goes back, at least 20 plus years, I wanna say. So you can look at that. It'd be nice to be able to try to extrapolate from that and sort of see what it looks like for our region here. It's an exercise I'd like to engage in if I have the time to do it. But yeah, that's about as close as we can get. But yeah, I absolutely understand. People want to know what industries, and that's again why I started looking at the job ads. That's as close of a proxy to where people are probably being laid off as you can get, that we can get down to specific occupations, specific industries, and some specific geographies. So that's really what that was all about.
No, and I think they're just, as you would say, they're just indicators. It doesn't really tell you a lot, but it gives you enough to kind of like, here's a trend that we should be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but if someone is increasing the number of job ads they have out there, say in the last 2 months, that really says something.
Yeah.
I mean, this window here really is where things have started to sort of cave in. That really tells me that there's something meaningful going on there. And that's why I'm really paying attention to those.
So a couple of final questions. And this is one that's probably more kind of general economics, not so much workforce economics. Given the short-term nature of the CARES Act, do you have long-term concerns once it wears off, given the size of the $3 trillion investment that has been made so far?
I'm not sure if I would say it's going to wear off. I mean, there's a survey floating around out there now. I think it was from, I want to say CNBC, back to our conversation from earlier. But a survey though of economists who they look at what future stimulus might look like, and they're anticipating, I believe, the Fed's balance sheet expanding to about 10 trillion by the end of June. So that would be an increase, I want to say, about another $3.5 trillion potentially injected over the next couple of months. So that will probably happen, and I think there will probably be more follow-up. I mean, Powell himself said this is not really the time to worry about deficits and whatnot, and so I don't know. There will be follow-up. Rates will remain low. There will be continued fiscal as well as monetary stimulus support going forward. So I'm not so concerned about that wearing off anytime soon. Support will be there as needed. That's just kind of where we are.
I mean, and turning to the fiscal support question, you and I have gone through this as well previously, which is there are some potential for some counter-cyclical pressures in the other direction just by the nature of how our economy works and how state and local governments fund it.
Right. Yeah, we saw that with the Great Recession, and then the cuts to, unfortunately, education here in Texas that happened about 2 years later, say about 2011 or so. So yeah, that's typically the way it works, is that a few years later, that's where after the tax revenues have come down for a couple of years, you start seeing, cuts to various things. And then, once the economy's back up again, it picks back up. But yeah, we're probably looking at that. Now, this very well could compress the timeline for that. I don't really know. You're hearing about local governments, county governments having to furlough workers, or seriously considering it already. And that's pretty early in this cycle, frankly. So these things may actually come into alignment and then come out at the same time, frankly, just because of, how severe and sudden and sharp this downturn has been.
So I'm just going to repeat an answers on this. The county level claims are available on the Texas Workforce Commission's website. If you go to kind of their data section, and it also lists the where the by industry, correct, at the state level?
Yeah, I was trying to think here. I accessed the industry level data statewide, though, from the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration,
Okay.
their website. Keep in mind, there are discrepancies between the data that you will find in those locations, and they don't agree. There's various reasons potentially why that is. I've gotten conflicting answers on it, but bottom line is it's at least an indicator down the week of directionally just where things are going. So there's still value there, absolutely. I mean, that's all we have.
No, and it was just more the location. TWC
Correct.
puts out two very simple spreadsheets that show county and show industry.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And if there's a need for additional locations of sources and things like that, because there is data out there too by industry as well as some demographic data as far as claims go as well. It's just statewide and it lags a bit, but it is out there. So.
Yep. So one final question before we kind of close it out is, someone wants to know, where do you see signs for hope and what makes them feel good about the outlook right now?
Well, and as I mentioned before, the proportion of employers that are pulling job ads off the net shrinking, that for me is a sign. Again, that's the only silver lining I've been able to find in what's happened in just the last 2 months here. Keep in mind, this is still pretty early on. It's going to take a while for all this to cascade through all the data that we have, no matter how frequent it is. So that's going to be what I'm looking at. That will be a turning point. I will say this much too. Let me back up for a second. The claims, the rate at which the claims seem to be increasing seems to be getting smaller as well. So we're not seeing the complete exponential leaps every week on week. That seems to actually be tapering off a bit. Now, maybe it's just, everyone or a lot of people who've applied have finally gotten through, and that's just, we're reaching the upper limits of that. That's another potential one as well. I'd certainly say keep an eye on it. When you see that happening more and more, that's also positive, but for that to translate into falling unemployment, higher employment, things like that still will take a while.
So I know you put your head into a spreadsheet on, day by day and are in data and dealing with numbers. So one final question is, what's on your reading list right now to get your mind off of all of that?
Well, I'll have to admit, my reading outside of, we'll say, work is pretty utilitarian. I'm reading things like how to, JavaScript or, statistical analysis and refreshing things like that, things that will be useful regardless of what else is going on. Beyond that, it's just consuming, catching up on some shows. Okay. You've got time to do that, things like that. But I also spend a lot of time working on computer projects, trying to solve technical problems there. So most of what I do is technical problem solving, even if it's work related or not. That's really what I do a lot of the time. So
that's where you get your passion. But I was just curious, kind of, how do you, given the fact that we're all stuck inside, how do you kind of break up the routine? So.
It's gotten a lot tougher. Guilty pleasure of mine, Rotten Tomatoes. I love reading good reviews of bad movies and TV shows. For me, that's highly satisfying. So I like to do that. I try to avoid the ones that talk about anything that's COVID related, because that's even, infiltrated there. But that is a guilty pleasure of mine, and one of the things that keeps me sane throughout all these crazy times that we're in.
Well, Parker, I know but I really appreciate you taking the time. You've been a great partner for the work we do here. You've really shared some good insights on how people should begin thinking about the labor market data. And it seems like the big takeaway is it's going to take time to find that data, and it's going to take time before we begin to see some indicators related to hiring.
Yes. Yeah.
And, as the audience will see on their screens, we've listed two important resources we've discussed today. One is the Houston Safe Work Program and the principles there that are critically important as we go forward. The Workforce Board, Gulf Coast Workforce Solutions has a Jobs Now page. So when employers are actually looking for folks, those job postings get posted quickly to that. So that's another resource just to begin seeing, where those things are. I want to thank our audience for participating in this first series of UpSkill Works forum. The next one will be next Wednesday, May 6th at 2:00. And it will focus on navigating the changing nature of work with a focus on the importance of skills and capabilities. Our guest for that UpSkill Works Forum will be Mandy Williams, also known as Black of Red and Black, Greg Hambrick, founder of Fast Forward Works, and Professor Fred Oswald from Rice University. And you can register online for Houston.org events. We will be sending a note out with a link to this recorded session, as well as kind of future things that are going forward. So thank you all for participating. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone.